So if this was true in the ancient world, how would an ancient reader have understood this passage? Or in some ways, I want to say, what do you see now in this passage that you might not have noticed before because you were working with a different set of assumptions? We have this sense that women were repressed, but in fact, those assumptions are, for the most part, wrong. And so that creates a new set of things that we might wonder about and consider when we read the New Testament.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Susan Hylen, and this was a book I was excited to talk about. I saw it on one of the tables at SBL, and it looked really interesting, and I waited a while because I was worried. It seemed like a book that was very popular, and I was worried that I might have trouble booking her as a guest. So I held off. And I'm kind of glad I did. I like to wait until a lot of the buzz is over to be able to discuss a thing. May not be the best way to do this podcast, but it's certainly how I approach reading. At any rate, her book is Finding Phoebe. And I highly encourage you to go out and buy this book. It's very helpful. It is directive it is instructive in a direct way, but it's also encouraging and helpful in that it shows you maybe how to think and guides you with the right questions and exercises. So, not a lot more to add to this. If you want to reach out and give me any feedback or suggestions, book recommendations, guest recommendations, gentle critiques, or aggressive lambasting, please do so at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Please don't forget, if you're hearing this for free, I appreciate the download. Go ahead and click subscribe. Follow this podcast wherever you subscribe to podcasts. Having regular downloads is very helpful, both for the growth of the podcast and for my fragile ego. If you want to do more than simply subscribe and follow and regularly download, you can use the link that's provided for you in the show notes to support the podcast for $5 a month. You will get audio episodes early. I'm still working on that. My plan is to have them out within 48 hours of recording them as an audio episode on Patreon. And then the schedule that I currently have for Patreon will be for video releases. So video episodes will be out. And then the audio episode will come out on the schedule every Wednesday here. So it takes a few months because I book things well in advance. So if you want to be able to hear stuff early, that's a great way to do it. And it's also something I highly appreciate. Anybody who's willing to chip in a few bucks a month to help me out financially, I would very much like to see this become something that I could do as my day job because I really love doing it. And I want to build an audience so that I know what is helpful for others to hear or watch, as it were. The podcast is also up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, Spoutable, TikTok. Links to the episodes get posted on WordPress and Tumblr. I am trying to push things out in as many different outlets, trying to push things out to as many different outlets as I can. So any feedback on what I could do to improve that? Oh, YouTube. I forgot. YouTube as well. Full audio episodes come out on YouTube, and short promotional video clips also come out. I'd love for that support. So I'll end my filibuster now by saying, here's my conversation with Susan Hylen. Susan Hylen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Will you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get going?
Oh, sure. I have a PhD in New Testament. I teach at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a great place to teach and learn. And I love talking about women in the New Testament.
Hence your book, Finding Phoebe, What New Testament Women Were Really Like. How How did this project come about? What was the motivation?
I was so I studied this for a long time. It began when I was teaching classes on women in the New Testament, just because students had an interest in it. And as I read and reread the ancient texts and started to do some more research outside of the biblical text about the world outside of the New Testament, I just noticed all kinds of things that didn't fit the picture that I had inherited as a scholar and as a person of faith, right? The things that were taught about women in the ancient world seemed largely to be false. And so over time, I studied that, and I also tried to understand, why is it false? Like, people have been reading these texts for a long time, right? So how were they trying to explain the evidence that they saw, and what might be a better explanation for it? So I've written 3 books actually on this subject, and the most recent one, Finding Phoebe, which is meant for a more popular audience, is kind of the plain sense explanation of this work that I've been doing for like 12 years or something of that nature.
So the best way I can think of to describe the book is it's information that provides context, and then exercises that challenge the participants, not necessarily the readers, the participants in these activities to go and find information that helps them flesh that out. Is that a fair description, do you think?
Yeah, so each chapter gives some background about the larger historical context of the New Testament, and provides some, different kinds of evidence for what I'm saying about women there. And then the examples that the participants engage with are all the New Testament examples. So if this was true in the ancient world, how would an ancient reader have understood this passage? Or in some ways, I want to say, what do you see now in this passage that you might not have noticed before, because you were working with a different set of assumptions?
Normally, I like to begin with, okay, what are you saying? What is your thesis? But that's a little bit more, that's kind of difficult with this, because I don't think that you are directly asserting anything. I think you're attempting to kind of help walk people through something.
Well, I'm
So,
not asserting anything about the biblical text per se, because I think people are still going to disagree over the way that we interpret them. But I think I am making an argument about the historical context, which was that women had much greater capacities for independent action than we have imagined that they did.
but that's still relative to this other thing. So, how would you describe the misconception?
Oh, so in the book, I describe it simply as the idea that women couldn't do much, right? We have this sense that women were repressed. They were subordinate to men always. They didn't own property, so they were entirely dependent upon men. And that creates a kind of picture that makes sense, right? That women sort of disappear into the background, and we shouldn't pay much attention to them. But in fact, those assumptions are, for the most part, wrong. And so that creates a new set of things that we might wonder about and consider when we read the New Testament.
I wonder if that's like a modern, like Western liberal understanding of life, knowing that these people did not live that same life, and then just kind of constructing something out of that negative space.
I think so in some ways. I mean, I do think when scholars started attending to these questions in like the 70s and 80s, there was more of a sense of, it's like all or nothing. It's either equality with men or forget the whole thing, right? That sort of this binary idea. And since then, scholars of all kinds, I think, have just grown more nuanced in the way that we approach those questions, whether it's about modern cultures, and the varieties that we see there, or about antiquity as well.
And so, like you said, the chapters cover different areas. So it's wealth and property, social influence and status, virtues of women, and speech and silence is the final one. So, what about wealth and property do you think? I know for me, the dowry was the most interesting part. Like that was the thing that stood out the biggest, I guess.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? So the headline is that women did own property and therefore accumulated wealth, as did men, and they owned about a third of property at the time, just as an estimate. So women could inherit property and did inherit property from their fathers. the thing that we think of as the dowry, right? We imagine it as being property that was given from the father to the husband, and it was the husband's property. But in fact, at the time, it was considered to be the woman's property. It was part of her inheritance. And when her husband died, or if they got divorced, he had to give it back to her. So it was sort of socially, culturally, as well as legally, in that kind of an instance, it was actually her property. And it wasn't the only property that she owned. So she, even though the husband controlled the property during the marriage, she also had property that he did not control, right? That was her property.
How do we get that number? A third of the property was owned by, like, I know that's not necessarily your thing, but I'm just
That's right.
curious. How do
And
we
those
arrive
things
at
are,
that?
the economic questions are really interesting to me, and I don't know that much about it. Like, how do we decide if ancient culture was flourishing economically or not, and all those kinds of things? So some scholars like Richard Thaler is a great one who have made these kinds of estimations, and they are drawing on all kinds of myriad, ancient sources, as much as one can tell. But it is an estimate, right? And it might be somewhat more or less than that. It's really kind of hard to judge those things.
So for the husband, is he controlling the dowry? Like he's responsible for it, like investing it or managing it or whatever?
Yeah. So, and if it's, let's say it's an olive grove, right? He can benefit from the production of olives, uh, and that money feeds into the household. But he can't sell the olive grove and then invest the money some other way, right? Because it's in essence not his to do that with.
Okay. And so is there a sense that this is a disincentive for something like divorce? That losing access to this would disincentivize divorce?
Yes, I think it's. I mean, certainly divorces did happen, but you can imagine how it might, especially if your wife was wealthy, right? And it also might be, therefore, be an incentive to treat her better, because she can divorce you under Roman law. Women could divorce just as well as men could. There was no legal, documentation required or anything. And so, yeah, if she leaves and takes her property with her, um, it just gives you a different perspective of just the internal dynamics of what a marriage might have been like. There were incentives on both sides, right?
Yeah. So I think that kind of flattened out reductive idea that I know I had, and it makes me feel a little bit better that you were saying some of these are discoveries. These are things that you weren't aware of either. But that flattened out picture is just like, nope, he's completely in control. There is no independence. There is no autonomy. So working backward from that, we can construct a certain kind of identity for women beyond just they were married to this guy.
Yeah, I mean, just the fact of owning property is big, right? Because when we've imagined women as really helpless in a lot of ways because they have no recourse to money, if that's not true, then it does change things. It doesn't mean that women have, substantial wealth and can always be independently, uh, have a good standard of living on their own. But it does change things, to think that a woman could just leave a marriage if she didn't like it and go on her way.
And I know we tend to like to think of wealth as a dollar value thing, which isn't even all that accurate. When you talk about people who are worth billions of dollars, it's not like they have a Scrooge McDuck vault with actual currency sitting there. But wealth in the ancient world was primarily going to be about resources, right? It was not a liquid thing.
Yeah, that's right. And people didn't always only, you know, exchange money for things. They also certainly would have exchanged goods and so forth. Yeah, so if women own land that can be productive, right, they're involved in managing that land, but they also are, able to use its produce, to do other things.
And from that, they can. This is kind of I think, a good transition point. They can have influence in their community and standing in their community. So
Right.
where
So
do
the
we see
second
that?
part of the book is about patronage and influence. So in the ancient world, relationships and the ways that people interacted were one of the idea of patronage was part of the social glue. So among individuals, patronage would mean things like, oh, you need a loan? I can give you a loan. It might be a small loan if maybe we're not wealthy, but if we are fabulously wealthy, maybe I can give you a really big loan, right? It might be, oh, you need a business contact in Alexandria. I know somebody there. Let me write you a letter and I'll send it with you. Or maybe even more locally, my friend also needs somebody to deliver their turnips. You could be the person with the cart that does that, right? So those relationships were really important, and having a good patron who was connected and influential was always good for everybody, and for men as well as for women. But on a civic level too, a lot of those fabulous buildings that we see, the libraries and the temples and all of these things were built by individuals, not by the city or the state. And so to have a civic patron, somebody who could donate either a whole building or its renovation, or even just part of a building. Some of the inscriptions note like, so and so gave a bunch of roof tiles to improve the building, right? So that was the way that cities ran themselves, right? And they did that. They honored people by posting what they did. And we see that because of these inscriptions, we see women as well as men acting in these ways as patrons. And they also are given civic titles like officials in the city, the person who oversaw the gymnasium or the games of the city, a civic magistrate, and certainly also priests are named in these inscriptions, and women hold the same titles often that men do.
I didn't bring this up in our correspondence because it was such a recent article, but so Jason Borges had an article, and about a month before this episode comes out, his conversation with me will be out, and that's just by virtue of how the order things are recorded. But he's talking about Phoebe as prostatis, and I think the term is proxenos. I should have brought it up. Am I right?
That she's called a status, and he relates that to the idea of a proxenos, I believe. Yeah.
Is the proxenos, is that one of those titles that you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yes, that could be. And again, it's sort of another way, especially in when people traveled, the kinds of connections that you could have in other places if you have a connection to that place, right? So labeling the ways that people could receive welcome then when they went to a different place, or the way that they, were connected to other people. Yeah, definitely. And so when we see somebody like Phoebe, who's mentioned in Romans 16:1, and she's labeled a patron of many and of myself as well, myself being Paul there in that case, right? We don't know for sure what Phoebe is doing, but it probably involves her social status within the community. And it may include hosting people, but also using her influence on behalf of other people, as women at the time are doing. At least that's what I think readers of Romans or listeners of it would have understood by those words of Paul's.
One of the things that he brought up, and again, I know you haven't heard it, but he does bring up that previous, commentators in the past would render prostatis with regard to Phoebe. And so that's the relevance of this. I'm sorry to take you down a rabbit hole about somebody else's work, but what he was saying is they would render that in translations and commentaries like assistant or secretary or something like that. And that is, I think, to refer to something we were discussing earlier, kind of taking our perception or the perception of the commentator and casting it back on those people. Well, we don't have a lot of detail in this passage here regarding Phoebe, and we have this word. And so we're just going to go ahead and render it in a way that we think is appropriate to the gender of the person referred to.
Right. And it's not false to say that the word could be translated in that way in some instances, often, right? But it does represent our own assumptions about what the word must mean in that context. when really, when you situate it in this wider set of historical evidence that I'm talking about, it's very likely that ancient people would have assumed she was a patron because that's the most common meaning, and because women are patrons. So why would she not be a patron?
And so I know that there are other sources of evidence that you look to in the book. So were there other examples of female patrons that you wanted to call out specifically now?
Oh, sure. Well, one to always mention is Junia Theodora, who lived about the same time of Paul in the city of Corinth, which was, of course, one of Paul's cities where he stayed for some time. And Junia Theodora had come from another area, and she lived in Corinth. And there are 5 inscriptions that praise her. There were messages sent by the area where she was from, and they're saying, to the people of Corinth, we praise this woman because she helped us in our time of need. She had clearly provided some kind of political and social influence at a time when the place where she was from, right, her homeland, was in a period of some political turmoil. And so 5 inscriptions is a lot, right? Most people don't have 5 inscriptions. So the idea that within Paul's milieu, right, we see this evidence that women are praised publicly for their kind of involvement, right? It's not a bad thing. She's not doing something wrong. They're not apologizing for it because she's a woman, but any of that is just like we're so grateful for Phoebe, or for Junia in that case, and her work on our behalf.
And so the praise that she's getting is reflective of some kind of virtuous behavior. So was virtue a gendered thing? And if so, was there overlap between the way that it was ascribed to men and women?
Yeah, great question. And that's the next section of the book, is about virtues of women. It definitely is a gendered thing, although I argue there's a lot more overlap than we have noticed in the past. So, for example, self-control was a really important virtue, that one of the cardinal virtues in the ancient world. And the word, when it's applied to men and women, often shows up slightly differently, right? So women, for example, are praised for self-control when they don't wear all of their fancy jewelry and sort of show off their wealth through this sort of extravagant display. Now, men also were praised for not partaking in luxuries, but they weren't expected to dress with jewelry, right? So it shows up in a different way for men than it does for women. But the idea is the same, right? The idea is that if you're spending all your money on luxury goods, you can't be as much of a patron to your community, right? It's wasteful, and it's just for you. It's just to show off your own standing, and it's not helping other people, even your own family necessarily, right? But also especially the community at large. And so praising people for self-control, it can sound like a restrictive virtue, but it is also something that is creating the idea that this person, the one who exercises self-control, right? Like Junia, Theodora actually is praised for self-control. And that idea is that she is somebody who's qualified, who's virtuous, the kind of person that we want to represent us, the kind of person that we would praise.
Yeah, I mean, nobody leaves inscriptions, or that I know of anyway. There's no inscriptions for people who were wearing all their jewelry, but there are inscriptions for people who like supported organizations or helped people more broadly in the community. So you kind of want to praise that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So speech and silence. This was another part of the book that I wasn't really sure what to expect going into this. So, should we understand speech differently in the ancient world than we think of it?
I think so. So there are these statements, both in the Bible and outside the Bible, that women should defer to men in their speech, or women should just be quiet, let her husband talk. It's not uncommon, right? So the kinds of teachings that we read in 1 Corinthians 14 or 1 Timothy 2, of women being silent or deferring to men, would have sounded normal to people. It wasn't like it was weird advice. It wasn't specific advice. It was just like, oh yeah, that's a virtue, right? But but what I realized is that what was a virtue was actually also, again, true for men. That to control your tongue when you were in the presence of someone who had higher social status than you was often something that men were encouraged to do as well. And young men especially were taught to, hang out with your elders so that you'll learn that it's not your turn to speak, right? Somebody else needs to speak first. Because that's hard. And philosophers at the time recognized that it's hard, right? It's hard for a lot of us to only speak when we should, or to say the right thing at the right time, right? So they're trying to cultivate that virtue, and it was a virtue for women as well. But the language that we see that does say women should defer to men is reinforcing the idea that there's a hierarchy, right? I'm not saying that women and men were equal. There was a sense that when other social factors were equal, men had and should have higher status than women, right? We never see them advocating for equality. But the thing that we have forgotten, because we're not in that culture, is that women sometimes had higher social status than men. Most women had higher social status than many men, right? Men that she would come into contact with on a regular basis, because social status varied so much depending on your wealth and your citizenship and the family that you came from and so forth. So we shouldn't expect that it's sort of a on-off switch, like all men have authority, all women do not. Rather, what ancient people would have understood was that these things are variable from place to place, right? So the general principle, women defer to men, good, they would have said. But the idea that, that women who were, an obvious example is that women who were slaveholders absolutely had authority over their male slaves, right? Nobody in the antiquity would have questioned that. But we've forgotten that when we read that language about speech and about having authority. And so we need to take that larger social context into consideration.
Was there a point where I don't know, classicists or antiquarians or people who work in biblical studies, where they figured that out? Or like prior to that, had they had an understanding that was just like, if woman and man are interacting, the woman is automatically the inferior socially? Was there a point when they figured out that it was a little more complex than that?
I think it's been happening slowly over time, but is a relatively recent development, this idea. And there was more of a tendency to just explain this sort of, there's this variety of evidence that I'm describing, right? On the one hand, we do see the idea that women should be silent. On the other hand, we see women being praised for speaking, right? And so scholars sort of put that evidence into two piles, and they were like, it doesn't make sense. It's contradictory. They just lived in a contradictory society, right? Which is possible. But now I think the idea is more that it wasn't contradictory to them, right? It feels that way to us because of our social context. But to them, it was just a complex, slew of social norms, right? Women, and men in certain contexts should be silent, but it doesn't mean that it was like every situation all the time, right? And I think it's easier to understand that now as I talk to people about it, right? Our lives are like that too. It's not like there's a single rule that applies in every situation in your life, but your culture teaches you how and where to apply that rule. And so it kind of makes sense that it wouldn't be sort of all or nothing.
So we've walked through the different chapters, and I kind of wanted to do that up front, so we had a little bit more time to do this. Do you feel like, or how would you describe the idea of Phoebe that you think one can construct from your book, or that you can construct from the research you did for your book?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot that we can never know about Phoebe, I guess is what I'll lead with, right? It's not that we can discern if she was married, if she was wealthy, if so, how wealthy was she? But there is a lot we can imagine based on what was historically true, right? And my goal in doing this isn't to try to pin Phoebe down and describe her in a way that is saying historically, here's who Phoebe was, but to say ancient readers of this text certainly had their own culture in mind as they read it, right? So my question is more, who would they have imagined Phoebe to be? What would they imagine to have been the likely thing about Phoebe, right? So I think the most likely thing, and certainly there was variety too, right? So it's not like there's a single answer. But the most likely thing was that ancient readers would have understood Phoebe as the one whom Paul trusted to send with his letter to Rome, right? She's the one carrying the letter. And that's why he introduces her and commends her towards the end of the letter before he starts greeting people who actually live there in Rome. So it's possible that she would have read the letter out loud to the group by naming her as a patron of himself, right? Paul is giving her a certain kind of social standing, introducing her in a way that's saying, hey, this is an important person to me. Take care of her, right? He actually asks them to help her in whatever she might need, right? Whatever her business is in Rome. So I imagine that Phoebe is a person that has some wealth, certainly enough to travel to Rome, right? And she's got a reason to go there. She certainly has standing in the community. She's named as a deacon of the church at Cancri, right? So she has an official kind of title there, and that makes us imagine that she was a leader in that group. And then she served as a patron and has this kind of influence as well. So I imagine in Rome they would have welcomed her, right? And as one of Paul's emissaries, I guess, tried to do the things that you would do when you were hosting an important person.
I think it was in a Douglas Campbell book, but I came across the idea. I don't think anybody had ever put this out there in all my years hearing sermons that if Phoebe is taking this letter, she's probably the one reading it aloud or performing it. There's a performative quality. So acting as an interpreter or instructor as well, not just delivering the message.
Yeah, that's right. And that suggests that she was a person who had some education also, which we didn't talk about, but was also possible for women, right? But yeah, as as any of us read something out loud, your inflection matters, right? And it is a matter of interpretation as well as just delivery. So it's interesting to think about how she might have performed it, so to speak.
And I think it's safe to infer that maybe even clarification. No, that's not. Yeah, he did say this way, but we talked about it. That's not what he meant, right?
Yeah, maybe so, right?
Why did you choose the format of a description and then the exercises? How did you land on that?
Yeah, I partly because just through my experience as a teacher, I think it's important to recognize that there are many good ways to interpret texts. And even I think a lot of readers have a sense that if we knew the historical background, we would have a single answer. We would know exactly what the texts mean. And that's scholars' fault. Like we have often talked that way. But in fact, I think historical knowledge often opens up possibilities for what a text might mean, like it does with Phoebe, right? It doesn't actually tell us everything about her. And there are some, questions that we could ask about what the story is saying. So to just sort of give rise to the possibilities, right? It doesn't make us land on a single answer. And I certainly didn't want to tell people what then they should do with that textual meaning in their lives, right? Because even as we decide about whether women can be leaders in our own Christian communities, there's a lot that goes into that other than just simply what the Bible says, including our tradition, our understanding of the movement of the Holy Spirit, and things like that, right? So I didn't want to complicate things by, sort of asserting my own opinion and saying this is the only way to do it. But instead to open up space for people to just read differently and to notice what's there, which to me is a really valuable thing, just encouraging people to read on their own and make decisions based on what they understand.
And so do you see this as something that, would it be better for people to read this with a group of other people or individually, in your opinion?
I think you can do it either way, certainly, but I have talked to some groups that have had great discussions on the basis of the book, and everybody reading a chapter and coming together and talking about it. Um, it's often an issue that we've talked about before, or we've heard sermons on, or whatever in our congregations. And so having a chance to talk through the ideas seems to be really interesting in a lot of contexts.
When I was looking over my questions, so I wrote these. I had been up really late because I work nights, and I was getting back on that schedule. And I wrote them, and I remember thinking when I wrote them, like, I should wait until I go get some sleep to send them. But and that decision was validated, or that impulse was validated for me when I was reviewing them. So there's a question in here. As written, it's a little weird and confusing. So I'll just put it out this way: the misconceptions that you start with by addressing in this book, how do you think they have affected people's lives, like day-to-day lives, and how do you see what you're doing in this book as beneficial in people's day-to-day lives?
I think there are two levels on that. On one level, I just hope that people will reread scripture and see things differently, just noticing things that you wouldn't have noticed before, right? When Martha hosts Mary in her home in Luke 11, like it's her home. Like we probably wouldn't have thought that, right? We have this sense that women don't own anything. They can't have homes. They can't be hosts, right? And so just to think about, it doesn't necessarily change what the story's about, but it does change the way that we might think about it and just imagine what's going on in that story, to think of Martha as one of the many hosts of people who had Jesus, hosted a dinner party around this, notable teacher. So that's one sense, just seeing scripture anew, and maybe appreciating it differently. Certainly, though, a lot of people, as they're reading this, are thinking about what are the things that women are allowed or not allowed to do in my community. And I do think that depending on what your community is, the book may contribute to that in some way, right? If you can see that women were actively speaking and that was okay, maybe for some people that changes the way that we think about whether or not we should allow women to speak in church. So I do think it can have concrete effects for women and for communities.
Have you gotten feedback from non-scholars on this book, and has it been helpful? Or are there ways that people would suggest that you improve it?
People often ask me, like, what's the pushback that you get, or something like that, and I haven't gotten a lot of substantive pushback. I have had some minor suggestions from people about things and often something, I wish you talked more about this or something, right? You can't do everything in any single book. But I haven't had any, major pushback, I guess, in terms of what it says. And overall, at least in terms of the people that I've talked to, maybe the people who aren't telling me are the ones who haven't liked it, right? But those who have reached out to me seem to have had a lot of useful conversation and just new ideas, and they have found it helpful.
Which is definitely what you were going for. And I don't know. I think the most fascinating thing for the podcast so far, or what is developing in what I appreciate the most about the podcast, is seeing how people engage with biblical texts. And that might mean liturgy, or that might mean how do people do Bible study. And so to see that you, I think, had that in mind when you wrote the book, because it's baked into the book. That was something I really appreciated. So that's my feedback, is like, I think that was a really cool idea, and it was really helpful.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you did. I think a lot of times, both what biblical scholars do, but also what people expect us to do, is to say, you tell me what the text means, and then I'll apply it to my life. And I don't like that approach. I think everybody can read the Bible and think about what it means. And so that was kind of what I was hoping to be able to open up space for.
I think so. I remember like 20 years ago reading this book, Colossians Remixed, and it wasn't the same thing, but they had they would have dialogues, they would have regular like expositional writing, and then they would do a targum for certain passages. And it was really engaging to know that, when I turn the page, something new, something challenging might come along. And I think since that book, this is the first book that I've read that I was like, oh, the author really wants me to not just see, look how much work I did and look at my footnotes. Not that I'm casting aspersions on anybody else, but a book can just seem like they wrote it and it's done. And you can pick it up or you can not, but it's nice to have a book that you pick up and it wants you to engage and then keep moving on after that. So I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Are there other subjects or other characters that you have considered maybe writing a similar book about?
I have not really been thinking about writing another book related to this topic, at least at the moment. The one that I'm considering that would be that I've been working on writing actually would be for the same audience level, right? Like not written for scholars, but written for regular folks, is on the Book of Revelation actually, and thinking about if you don't want to interpret Revelation like a fundamentalist, is there another option, right? So presenting sort of how other people who want to continue to read Revelation and engage it might find meaning in that text. Most of us, if you don't like the fundamentalist approach, you just ignore it altogether and forget that it exists. So is there another possibility? And that would also, I think, have a kind of participatory nature to the text, right? Opening up space for people to look at it again.
So that's something you're actively working on, or is that just conceptually a thing?
No, I've actually written a couple of drafts of chapters for that one.
Okay. Well, I look forward to that. I will definitely be bothering you again once that book comes out. Was Phoebe like the first and only idea for this book, or were there others that you thought this might be someone helpful to dig into as well?
Oh, yeah. So it was always meant to be a book that was about the question of the history of women in the period. And I didn't initially start out thinking about Phoebe as a sort of central character, but over time, I can't even remember how I landed on the idea that like having a central example that I came back to and thought about would be just a useful way of approaching the subject matter for people, for a non-specialist audience. So that was where I ended up.
So what have I not asked about from the book? And there's plenty, because there's a lot in the book that you were hoping I would ask about.
I would say, I guess one thing that strikes me that people who haven't read the book might want to know about are just thinking about the ways that, because so much of the discussion today is about whether or not women can speak, right? So back to that question about speech and silence, just noticing the ways that women's speech is sometimes recorded and often just assumed in the New Testament text. So certainly Phoebe, we're imagining now as a speaker, right? But there are also women like Anna, who's named as a prophet in Luke 2, who is clearly an important person, right? And she speaks about the infant Jesus when he's brought to the temple, right? Identifying him as part of God's redemptive story. So this idea that if you, knowing the cultural background, that wasn't weird, right? It wasn't unusual to have an Anna. It wasn't as common as having, men speaking, right? But it wasn't strange, and people would have understood exactly what was going on. And so when we think about the capacities for women to speak, and the various ways that they would have done that, certainly also as property owners, you can't, take care of your olive grove if you're not allowed to talk to anyone. You've got to somehow get that product to market, right? So just sort of everyday normal interactions that people had, and that was something that women did too. I think that's really important.
I think there's this idea, because you'll hear it when people say like, it's 2024, this or that shouldn't be happening anymore. And then there's also like on the the kind of other end of that is like, well, that was back then. Well, back then they didn't. And I think there's a very so flat or reductive understanding of what the present is and should be, and what the past was and should be. And so it's helpful to find out that like people are people and we're not that special, and that human relationships have, they might be simple sometimes, but there's always a certain amount of complexity there. And learning that about other people helps us learn about ourselves.
Yeah. And I will say, you're saying that makes me also think to say that as Christian readers, we have often sort of we often try to compare the New Testament, Jesus, as offering something better than the culture around him. And so we have often suggested that, Jewish women were especially oppressed, for example, and, maybe Jesus was better than that, even, and so forth. And I do like to push back against that too. I think that the historical work that I've done shows that the larger world, which included Jewish women, had all kinds of possibilities and opportunities for women's agency, and alongside also, some sense that they were inferior to men, and that the New Testament largely makes sense in that context, right? It's sort of talking about the same set of things. It's not really distinct for them. And I guess sort of back to the question about whether people, one of the questions that people ask me often is, what to do with that? Because we really do have this sense that the New Testament should be countercultural in every sense. And I think that is something that comes again from our culture and not from the ancient world. They were not as impressed with being countercultural as we are in like challenging social norms. But that Christianity in some ways presented itself as the way that you could achieve the values that you already held in society, right? So if self-control is a value for you already, which it was, Christianity is the path to help you get there. And so in that sense, maybe it makes more sense why it looks the way it does.
I think too, there's an idea when you think about historical things, or at least this is a thing I think I run into, particularly with biblical texts. A lot of people's understanding around those is ahistorical in that they think that the message being presented, particularly by Jesus, is like universal, and they don't, I think, really appreciate, and I know I haven't in the past, how important it is that like what he's saying or what Paul is saying or anyone else, it has to make sense to the people they're saying it to. And so like you referenced fundamentalists, I think there's almost this gradient toward like, well, if it's predictive, it doesn't matter if the people who would have originally read or heard or experienced this message didn't understand it. And it's all about them. It's all about the person that that I might be having a conversation with. It's this message, and for us, I think we've broadened Jesus out, particularly into like such a philosopher of like a universal message. But that wouldn't fit in the world that he was in, and it does matter that the people around him understood him, right?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't have these texts and stories left to us if they didn't make any sense to people at the time. And so, yeah, it's a different question, I think, to ask, what did the text really mean, as if it had one meaning that was designed by God. That's an interesting question, but in my mind, we don't really have ways to access that, except perhaps through prayer, if that's possible. But to me, what's interesting is that ancient readers, the earliest Christians, right? They were clearly taken by these texts, and it meant something to them. And so, thinking about what it meant to them can be a really important part of understanding, what it might mean to us.
Are there places that you would direct people, other than your book, to learn more about the ancient context, particularly for the lives of women?
There are a couple of good books recently. One by Nijay Gupta. I'm trying to remember the name of it.
Is it Tell Her Story?
Tell Her Story. Yeah, that's a good one also, and also written in a way that it doesn't have a lot of footnotes and that kind of thing. It's easier to read. Yes, that's the main one that comes to mind. I'm terrible at trying to remember books and names of authors.
That's fair. What do you read for fun?
Novels. I like to read. I read a lot of nonfiction for work, and for fun, I like to read novels. Right now, I'm reading a book I like a lot by Niall Williams. He's an Irish author, and the one I'm reading now is called History of the Rain. I like it.
Any other? I mean, look, go nuts. What else? Because you said novels so enthusiastically.
Yeah.
Really throw them out there.
I read all kinds of things. I read, I like, like murder mysteries and just all kinds of books. And I'm not good at remembering all of the names of them or the authors. It's always hard to come up with, especially on the spot.
So a thing happened a week or two ago. I was editing an episode, and when I do that, I like to get all the recommendations kind of organized and everything. So I was trying to get a hyperlink for one that a guest had said she really liked, and so the Amazon page or something was up over on this monitor, and my wife came to say good night or something, and she saw the cover and she was like, "Oh, that looks good." So I'm going to start pressing people, especially when they're like enthusiastic about novels, because I want to be able to buy my wife like random gifts of books. So yeah, sorry if I'm being a little pushy there. Any others?
So one of my favorites recently is The Great Believers by Rebecca Mackay, I think is her name. I really like that novel.
Okay. Unless you have anything else for us, I appreciate you sitting down with me, and I really enjoyed your book. And so I hope the listeners will go out and get it. I think they'll benefit from it.
Thank you so much. This has been really fun talking to you. I appreciate your having me on.
It was my pleasure. Take care. Thank you so much for listening. Next week's guest, John Donne, is returning. John Donne of New Testament scholarship and also Two Cities podcast fame. We will be discussing the movie The Judas Project. It is a 90s, I guess, concept art kind of thing, Jesus movie about what if a messianic figure like Jesus appeared. I'll say today, but what I mean is, 30 or more years ago, nearly 40 years ago. So the link to that on YouTube, you can watch it for free on YouTube. That will be available in the show notes to this episode. So if you don't want to go in blind, absolutely take 90 minutes of your life and watch that movie so you can follow the conversation maybe a little bit better. So without further ado, here's a quick preview of my conversation with John Donne from next week. And I just want to close out with, if you get the opportunity to love someone, make sure you take it.
What I love about Jesus films is not that, that little bit of this film is just dead on and that little bit of that film nails it. For me, it's more like I really appreciate the variety of ways in which certain episodes could be visualized. And it makes me realize that there's a lot going on hermeneutically when we think about what we're reading, when we visualize what we're reading. That's really kind of the aim of the book that we've just written, that I mentioned at the beginning. And because of that, there's certain moments as they're sort of translated visually to film that make me think like, oh, wow, I've never thought of it that way. Not, this must have been how it happened. It's more like, wow, why have I taken this for granted? I've just always assumed it happened like this sort of way. And it could have happened otherwise. Or maybe I should consider sort of how I'm sort of directing the film in my head, basically, as I'm reading. Maybe I should consider directing it a little differently. So that's kind of more the angle that I come at. And so I'm more kind of just open to different sort of possibilities rather than thinking this has nailed it, this is accurate, this is the best, etc.